All right, we're going to be looking at chapter 4 this week, and the lecture is going to be a little bit different than what's in your textbook. So you need to make sure that you read your textbook and you complete the mind tap activities for this week, as well as learn the glossary terms. But the lecture is going to be a little bit different. You'll find out as you go through college that often the reading and the lecture do not match up, and the tests could be over either or both. And so you need to make sure that you read as well as follow the lecture. What I want to talk about for now is the road to independence. I want to talk about how, because as we're getting through our textbook, we're getting closer and closer to the point to where our founding fathers were willing and able to declare independence. So how did they get to this point? What was it that made the British colonists in America more likely to do that than, say, the Spanish colonists in Mexico or South America or somewhere else? What are the French colonists in Canada or whatever? What was it that made that happen? Well, the British had a centuries-long tradition of more democratic types of government and things like that. And so when you put in the history they had, the traditions they had, and other things, the philosophy and things that came along, it led them to have a much likelier chance of becoming able to declare independence, if that makes sense. We can take this at least as far back as 1215, the year 1215, to the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta, the term is a Latin term that means the Great Charter or the Great Letter, and Magna Carta limited the king's authority. Now, it was the first document, at least in British history, that we know of that limited the king's authority. In fact, it may be the first one really in the world. Um, the king at the time was a man named King John. His enemies, his detractors, called him King John the Soft Sword. King John loved to fight wars, and he was constantly at war with France, but he lost a lot. And so that's why they called him the Soft Sword, because his sword could not seem to bring about a lot of victories. Well, these wars were expensive, and the nobles who paid all the taxes, the nobles were the landowners. The peasants didn't own the land. They lived on the land owned by the nobles. But the nobles were tired of paying taxes for it and tired of him losing all the time. If they're going to be at war, at least get something out of it. So they eventually kind of rebelled against him, and they forced him to sign the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta originally only applied to the nobility, to the lords themselves. You know, lords were the people who own the land. That's where the word landlord comes from, because they are the people who own the land you rent it from. And so that's where that came from. But this originally only applied to the nobles. But the Magna Carta, among other things, included certain rights such as no taxation without representation. Does that sound familiar? It should, because that idea became ingrained in British, English, and then American thought for over the centuries. And this is what led to our Declaration of Independence. So there was no taxation without representation. So that's when Parliament was formed, that would then have to approve any tax measures that the king wanted to do. Okay, it also included a trial by jury of your peers. In other words, if you were going to be accused of something, the king couldn't just accuse you and execute you or put you in prison. There had to be a trial. You had to have a jury, and the jury had to include people who were your peers, which for the nobles, and this is only applied to the nobles, would have been other nobles. And there also was a provision in there of habeas corpus. In other words, no illegal imprisonment. There had to be a warrant for your arrest. You couldn't just be captured and put into jail. We have that today. If you get arrested and put into jail, they have a certain period of time. I think in most states it's about 72 hours before they have to release you, unless they charge you with a crime. They cannot just hold you indefinitely without there being a crime and an official charge being brought down. If they don't have enough evidence to charge you, they cannot hold you. Okay, that's called habeas corpus. If they hold you longer than they're supposed to, your attorney can file a habeas corpus and you can be let out of jail. So that was really the beginning of the road to independence for the American colonists. Then we shift a few centuries later to the Renaissance, the rebirth. This started really in southern Europe, and it spread north to northern Europe and eventually to England. But the Renaissance shifted popular focus from faith and the church to earthly things or secular concerns. Now, let me explain something. During the Middle Ages, things were very difficult and very challenging. Most people, 90+%, nearly 100% of the population, lived in poverty. I'm talking extreme poverty. And had very little to eat. Their lives were miserable for the most part, and so really all they had to look forward to was heaven. Okay, and so the period of the Middle Ages was known as the Age of Faith, because this is when people were miserable. They looked to heaven. They were faithful to the church. They wanted to go to heaven. They did everything they could. But the Renaissance brought about wealth. It brought about prosperity, and people suddenly realized, hey, I'm going to have a fairly decent life here. I don't have to wait till heaven to enjoy life. And so the Renaissance, as it spread with it a shift away from the church, away from faith, to earthly things. In other words, what can I do here on the earth that makes my life a little easier? And the reason that's important is because as that attention and focus shifted away from the church, the authority of the church grew less and less. And that was eventually going to spread to the authority of the government. So as people began to now be in a place where they could then begin to question the authority of the church, the authority of the government, and things like that. So that was that shift away from faith, away from the church, away from authority, to more self-centered, inward-focused, earthly concerns about how you could have a good life now, how you could have freedom now, etc. Then in the 1500s, starting with Martin Luther, you have the Protestant Reformation, where Martin Luther questioned the authority of the church and the teachings of the church. And up to this point, the Catholic Church was predominant. There were other denominations and beliefs and religions around, but not many. But it was dominant. And salvation belonged to the church. If you wanted salvation, you had to be a member in good standing of the church, and you could go to heaven. But if the church ever excommunicated you, that meant that you could not get to heaven. So you had to be in good standing with the church. But Martin Luther came along and said, hey, salvation doesn't come from the church. Salvation is by grace through faith alone. So the church doesn't grant you salvation. Salvation is something that comes from God and comes to you. So basically, it took the church out of being the place of the middleman in the business of salvation. So not only was the authority of the church being questioned, but salvation was now in the hands of the individual. So as England eventually moved to Protestantism in the Church of England, and in Scotland it was the Church of Scotland, or we know it as the Presbyterian Church, it really caused, again, a stronger ability to be able to reject authority altogether, not just the authority of the church, but eventually the authority of the church. And it also brought more focus on the individual. So when the English came to the Americas and they became American colonists, they were primarily Protestant. They were primarily evangelical, so they didn't really depend on the church for their salvation, because that was something that was between them and God and alone. And so they weren't really dependent upon that authority. They didn't respect that. And it's not they didn't respect the authority so much, but they just didn't depend on it. They didn't bow down to it like people in times past had done. So that was a significant step forward. Then in the 1600s, you have the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights. They had a king in England who was Catholic. They didn't like him, so they overthrew him and beheaded him. And then after a while, after that, they had a non-monarchy. They had a supposed to be type of a republic, but it didn't work out that way. Oliver Cromwell turned out to be a kind of a dictator. He was overthrown a few years later, and they bring in a king and queen that agreed to a Bill of Rights. And guess what? The Bill of Rights included no taxation without representation, trial by jury of the peers, etc. Those kinds of things. But this was now applied to people in general and not just the nobility. But it also further limited the monarchy, and it gave a lot more power to the people's representatives, the parliament. It required the monarch to sign the parliament's bills. In other words, the king or queen couldn't just do what he or she wanted to. If parliament passed a law, the king now had to sign it as a law. Okay? And so really it strictly limited or severely limited the king's authority and gave a lot more authority to the people and their representatives. It also required the monarch or the king or queen to respect civil liberties. So that was the 1600s. So now by the time we get to the 1700s, man, there's this long tradition of limiting the power of the government, questioning the authority of the government, questioning the authority of the church. In other words, questioning authority, period. Focusing on self, independence of self. If you didn't need the church for your salvation, you could be a lot more independent. If you could question authority, whether it was the authority of the church, the authority of the government, or whatever, you could be a lot more independent. If the king suddenly had to now bow down to laws that your representatives pass, that gives you more power. So there was this growing independence in the way people thought, in the way they acted, especially in the American colonies. And there was this growing idea of certain civil rights and civil liberties that people expected. It wasn't just something that the king now gave, it was something that the king had to protect. And it was kind of this change in thinking, because up to this point, and in most countries still at this point, the king might give you civil liberties, or might not. But now you had them, and the king had to protect them. So that was a change in thought. Okay, and so really, you see how it's setting up the mindset that our founding fathers were have to have in order to be able to get to the point that they actually declared their independence. You also consider that the colonies were a long way away from home. They were a long way away from England. You couldn't just send an email to the king and say, hey, we got this problem, what you want us to do about it? You actually had to write a letter, had to get on a boat when a boat left, and it wasn't like they left every moment of every day. And then it had to go across the Atlantic. It might take weeks or months to get there, if it got there at all. Then the king might or might not read that letter, or the prime minister, or whoever was in charge, might or might not read that letter. They may or may not respond. If they did, it might be days, weeks, months, even years later. And then when they finally did, if they did, it would have to then travel across the Atlantic, and it may or may not get there. So there was a long way from England. And if there were issues that came up, you didn't have time to wait 6 months or more for a response from England to make a decision. You had to make a decision on the spot. And the king, the way they had set up their colonies is they had allowed them a lot of freedom. The king didn't really, in the early days, the kings didn't really care much about what was going on. They just allowed the colonists a lot of freedom to make a lot of decisions. So they had their own representative assemblies. They had their own ways of doing things that they had established in those colonies, and that's the way they liked it. Okay, and so just in the colonies, even more so, way more so than England, the people, a lot of the average people, were able to vote. I mean, like in the New England colonies, like we talked about last week, over 50% of the adult males in New England were able to vote, whereas it was far fewer than 30% in England and some of the other colonies. So they had just gotten these practices over a century or almost 2 centuries, these practices of freedom and self-governing and things like that, and they didn't want to give that up so easily. Then you have enrolling in that in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, the Enlightenment. Because the colonists were had a higher percentage of educated people and literate people than the Europeans did, a lot more of these colonists were involved in the Enlightenment. So you had compulsory education in New England, where everybody had to learn how to read and write. But even though other colonies didn't necessarily have that, there was still a higher percentage of people being educated in the colonies than in Europe. And so Benjamin Franklin started these in the mid 1700s, started these groups where people would sit and they would discuss these ideas from the Enlightenment in Europe, and they would add their own thoughts and things like that. And these sprang up in various towns and cities across the colonies. And so average Americans were being exposed to these Enlightenment ideals that only the elite educated people in Europe were exposed to over there. So very few people over there experienced those ideas. A good number of people in America, in the American colonies, experienced those ideas. During this time, there were a lot of advances in science. Think about Benjamin Franklin. I mean, he was the ultimate in the Renaissance, man. He invented things. He had patents. He had did scientific experiments, all kinds of stuff. With the Enlightenment came this confidence in human reason. In other words, you could figure out the truth by reasoning your way to the truth, if that makes sense. There was this skepticism that arose. We often hear, I think, therefore I am. That was a philosopher from Europe that had actually made a statement saying that the only thing I cannot doubt is that I'm sitting here doubting. And basically that kind of morphed into I think, therefore I am. So these Enlightenment thinkers basically doubted everything they had been told. And so there was a lot of skepticism in Europe, in France especially. It led to rejection of the church and the teachings of the church in large number. Now, that did not happen so much in the United States or in the American colonies, but there was still this growing skepticism, this growing doubting of things, which then caused them to question authority, question the things that people had been telling them all their lives. And so they began to try to find the truth through reasoning, not just because, hey, the Bible says so, or hey, because the preacher says so, or hey, because the king says so. We're gonna doubt it, and we're gonna try to find the answer ourselves through the scientific method. We're going to try to find the answer ourselves in human reason and things like that. During this time period in the Enlightenment, there was an emphasis on natural law and rational principles. In other words, that there were certain laws of nature, like the law of gravity and things like that, that governed the way the universe worked, and these rational principles as well. Benjamin Franklin was the embodiment of the Enlightenment. He believed these things. He discussed these things. He shared these things. Political philosophy, especially that was adopted by our founding fathers, was developed by John Locke and Thomas Hobbes in England. And so many of their ideas are things that our founding fathers grasped onto and used in the founding of our country, in the writing of the Declaration of Independence, in the drafting of the Constitution and things like that. But basically, the Enlightenment allowed people to think and to question and to doubt and to try to find different answers, try to find ways to get those answers apart from what had been accepted before. So there was this growing independence of thought, this growing movement away from traditional authority, traditional ideas, traditional beliefs, which set them up further for the American Revolution. Then in the early 1700s, we had a great spiritual awakening. It's called the First Great Awakening. A second Great Awakening happened in the late 1700s and early 1800s. But it was a spiritual revival during the 1700s. It really kind of got started when a congregational or Puritan minister by the name of Jonathan Edwards preached a sermon called Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. You can go on YouTube and you can see a reenactment of that sermon if you would like to. You can actually read the sermon if you would like to. You can find it online. It's very interesting. But basically in this sermon, he declared that we are all sinners and that we are hanging over hell by a mere thread, and that God at any moment could cut that thread and we would go tumbling into hell, that we needed to repent of our sin. As he preached to that sermon, the contemporary accounts tell us that people were crying out for mercy in the middle of his sermon. He was so weak from it because it was so powerful that he could barely stand up while he was preaching the sermon himself. But it led to a great number of people becoming believers in Christ, and the church exploded and grew in numbers during that time period. One of the powerful preachers of this was George Whitefield. He was an Anglican pastor. He helped found Methodist Church, which came out of the Anglican Church, and he had actually pastored in Savannah, Georgia, shortly after John Wesley, who founded the Methodist Church as well, pastored there in the 1730s. But he preached a lot around the colonies as well as in England, and he would go out and preach. There were no buildings that could contain the crowds that he preached to. He preached to crowds that were 10, 20,000 people. Go think about it. They didn't have microphones and speakers back then. So he would go stand on the stump of a tree and preach to these people, and it would be dead silence because people wanted to hear what he had to say. And thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people were coming to know Christ as their Savior. There were large numbers of conversions. People joined the Presbyterian churches and the Baptist churches, or they split off from the older established churches. Now, some of the older established churches did not like these new doctrines, these new things that were being taught. So the Presbyterian church, for instance, kind of split a little bit during that time period. Baptist churches really grew. So Baptists and Presbyterians really grew, and Methodists came out of this, really grew in large numbers during this time. Some of the older established churches which rejected these teachings and this emotionalism, what they considered emotionalism, kind of split, and so that happened. But what I want you to understand is that in this, people's salvation was even more so in their own hands and not the churches, Um, and so, again, the church is not in control of your spirit anymore. It's control of your life anymore. Now, they were dedicated to their churches, don't get me wrong, but again, it was that ability to question that. We also see that in this first great awakening, it was very emotion driven. So it rejected the old formalized religion and rationalism of the Enlightenment. So even though the Enlightenment and the Great Awakening kind of did the same thing as far as questioning authority and helping people to be independent of authority, helped them move towards the road down the road to a revolution. It was a little bit different. Those who were more on the emotional and religious side of it would have rejected the rationalism of the Enlightenment, but it kind of had the same consequences. They both became somewhat independent and less dependent upon government authority or church authority. But I also want you to understand that large numbers of churches were established during this time period, and it literally changed the course of history because so many people became Christians and dedicated themselves to serving God that it literally changed the course of American history at that point. And the Second Great Awakening in the 1800s did the same thing. The effects of the Great Awakening decreased the importance of the established churches. New colleges were founded. Princeton was founded by the Presbyterians in 1746. Columbia was founded in 1754. I'm drawing a blank on what denomination, what group founded that one. Brown was founded by the Baptists in Rhode Island in 1764. Rutgers was founded by the Church of England or the Anglican churches in 1766. And so these colleges were founded to help train ministers because there were so many new churches being established, they had to train ministers. Something else, it spread beyond the whites to the blacks, including slaves and Native Americans. So this wasn't just a white phenomena only. It spread to black people, including the slaves and the Native Americans. It boosted the religious prominence of women because women were not, even though they were not allowed to speak and stuff like that, they became more prominent and more significant. It blurred denominational lines. Before, there had been strict denominational lines, but during these revival meetings, several denominations would come together and preach. So George Whitefield, who was an Anglican, people from all denominations would come and listen to him, and that's something that would not have happened before. So it kind of brought people together in a sense. It empowered ordinary people to act publicly in questioning authority. Okay? So that's the end of that. So those are the things that kind of set our founding fathers up to be prepared to declare independence. Now, next week, we'll look at the things that the immediate causes of the revolution, but these are the things that kind of set our colonists on the path to revolution. Don't forget to read the chapter and learn the glossary, and make sure that you do your mind tap by Sunday at 11:59. Thank you.